Okay. Well, as always, thanks for showing up. It's a little bit rainy out, but still not bad. It's autumn. Autumn in Seattle. Can't beat it. Again, thanks for showing up. Appreciate your time here. We're going to have another great presentation. Drummond Reed is here. He's a great speaker, as most of you already know. So we're thrilled to have him. So as we get started, first of all, thanks to our sponsors. Thanks to Evernym Incorporated for sponsoring this HSM event. Thank you, Drummond. Evernym is a leading vendor of SSI, self-sovereign identity solutions for businesses and individuals. The Sovrin Foundation is an international nonprofit public trust for the Sovrin Network. Also, thanks to Aaron Bodmer of UW Commotion Labs. Aaron lives here, so this venue is by way of Aaron, and we always want to thank him because without Aaron, we would have no home. We'd be on the streets, and that's always hard to do, a meetup on the streets. If you're interested in learning more, commotion.uw.edu is the place to go for that. Okay, so on to the presentation, Drummond Reed. He'll be talking about an introduction to decentralized identity and Hyperledger Indy. Actually, I was going to say, yeah, that somewhere, yeah. I'm just looking at this. Hey, you guess where this came from? So, Drummond, you'll be presenting the okay. Drummond has spent over 2 decades in internet identity, privacy, and trust framework. He joined Evernym as Chief Trust Officer after Evernym acquired Respect Network, where he was the CEO, co-founder, and co-author of the Respect, which was honored with the Privacy Award at the 20 where he serves as chair of the Sovrin Trust Framework Working Group. He's a member of the steering committee of the Centralized Identity Foundation and co-editor of the DID specification in the W3C Credentials Community Group. He served as co-chair of the OASIS XDI Technical Committee since 2004. Where do you find the time of day? Which is OASIS with Semantic Data Exchange Protocol that implements privacy by design. And then prior to starting Respect Network, Drummond was executive director of 2 industry foundations, the Information Card Foundation and Open Identity Exchange. He's also served as founding board member of the Open ID Foundation, ISTPA, International Security Trust and Privacy Alliance, XDI.org, and Identity Commons. And in 2002, Drummond received the Digital Identity Pioneer Award for Digital ID World. And in 2013, he was cited as an OASIS Distinguished Contributor. Holy cow. We are so glad to have you back. Drummond spoke in July, I want to say it was, and it was a phenomenal talk. And so I want to hand off to Drummond. We've got another wonderful talk coming. So please welcome Drummond.
Yes. How many folks in the audience have heard of decentralized identifiers? Ooh, a surprising amount. How many folks have heard that at the W3C TPAC conference 2 weeks ago, their annual conference in Lyon, France, there was the DID Working Group organizational meeting, had 61 attendees come. It's the largest organizational meeting they've had for a working group in several years. And it was unanimous among the folks there. There was one company that apparently had a concern about this was too complicated for the W3C. But everyone else was like, no, it's not. Let's get into it. So anyway, that's just one little piece of news. I guess I am going to use these slides, so we'll be good for that.
Hey, Drummond,
yeah.
Speak up a little bit, please.
Sure. Is this picking up well enough, or do I need to relocate the mic? Or?
No, you're good.
Okay. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about governance frameworks. You tell me what is that? You probably, yeah, I think you can see the slides best that way. And for those, this is not going to be a deeply technical talk because governance frameworks are really about how you connect the technology of blockchain and the various things you build on it with the real world, actually solve the real world problems. And my thesis is going to be you're going to see more and more about governance frameworks because as blockchain technology gets more and more to real-world business solutions, you have to have this piece. And my goal will be to explain why, and then get into some specific examples. So if you're thinking about doing something with a blockchain, you can go, okay, where does it fit? And feel free to come up and talk to myself. Scott Perry is here, who's a member of the Sovrin, now called Governance Framework Working Group, has been from the outset. And we've also got another member of Evernym here, Nick Reinhardt. So we're all in a position to help answer your questions afterward or dive down into these topics. All right, let's dive in here. Again, Rich already covered all this, how long I've been doing this stuff, and all I can say is 20 years of doing this, and actually I want to point out right here, this conference, Internet Identity Workshop, happened also 2 weeks ago, and I've been to all 27. That happens twice a year. The last one was the largest one ever, and it was almost completely dominated by self-sovereign identity. It is a watershed in this problem of internet identity, and we'll be covering why in this whole thing. So start out, blockchains and governance. Now if I turned around and, Hyperledger generally considered to be, blockchain for business, governed, private blockchains that are governed. Now, if I turned around and said, yeah, generally public blockchains, what's different is they're ungoverned. How many folks would generally agree with that statement? Go ahead and put up your hand. Actually, you didn't fall for the bait. Totally untrue, okay? All blockchains are governed one way or another, okay? The real bottom line is, right, we control the machines. They don't control us, at least until we get to Skynet, and hopefully, it's a whole other subject. So we are always the ones that are going to turn around and govern how the blockchain works, okay? And govern the things that are built on top of it. It's just a question of how. And I'm going to, not drastically, but at least somewhat oversimplify here by talking about 3 major models of governance, and this applies primarily to public blockchains. Private blockchains are all governed fairly explicitly one way or the other. And we'll talk about governance frameworks with private blockchains. But the public blockchains, there tend to be these 3 models and evolutionary in this direction, okay? We started out primarily governance through open source communities, meaning governance of the code, because once the code is up and running, it's our permissionless networks. Obviously, Bitcoin and Ethereum, they're very well known. Now, Bitcoin is probably not fundamentally changing that model. Ethereum is moving a model from proof of work, which is very computationally and ecologically expensive, towards proof of stake. And with proof of stake, it may be moving into a governance model for Ethereum itself that is, it would actually take it over to the algorithmic category. Now, some of the early other blockchain projects out there distinguish themselves by saying, we're going to build governance into the chain itself, right? We're going to have staking. We're going to have voting powers that are accumulated with tokens. Developers are going to earn the ability to vote on that. And the algorithm itself is going to evolve in the chain. And there are a couple examples. This article, highly recommend. It's a good Medium article on the various different approaches that are being taken there. But still, the basic idea is build the governance into the chain. Don't really involve the humans other than in the design of that governance. The third model, which is emerging more now, is governance frameworks. And that's what I'm going to be concentrating on here today and giving you an example of with what we're doing with Sovrin. But Sovrin's not the only one, okay? Verus1 is another global blockchain designed specifically for self-sovereign identity. Uses a governance framework, has no token associated with it. And then Decred's another very interesting project in the EU that also has explicit off-chain governance, again, to solve this problem of tying it into the real world. So the first reason, as I was explaining earlier, that we're going to see more about governance frameworks is governance is not just a problem for the chain itself. You can govern a chain perfectly and have something that doesn't tie into the real world. It doesn't actually solve a problem, whether it's land registries or it's medical records or it's supply chain. If you want to solve those problems, you actually have to connect with these, totally unalgorithmic institutions called regulatory bodies, right, and legislatures and government agencies and business policymakers. So that's what governance frameworks do. There's a second reason you're going to start hearing a lot more about governance frameworks, and that's specific to self-sovereign identity. And the simple the thesis I put in front of you is, show me a blockchain project that doesn't need identity. I've been doing this for long enough now that even the ones where it's like, no, we don't need identity, turning around, they're getting down the road and they're like, oh yeah, actually we do need identity. So you're going to have a tie into every blockchain project out there that is going to turn around and say, I need this, and as soon as you involve identity, you're going to involve governance. It's that simple. You're also, Scott's going to say, and trust assurance. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So that's where it's going to tie in, and I'll get very specific as to why I think you're going to see a lot more in that area. Now, in order to explain that second one and to talk about the specific example of the Sovrin Governance Framework, I'm going to cover the same slides I did in my last talk, but very quickly. It's just the standard way that I explain why is sovereign identity eating the world right now, at least eating the identity world, okay? And to do that, you just have to look at what is the three major models of identity that have evolved over the last 20 years as we've been dealing with the internet. The starting point was exactly what we had before we had the internet. You log in, you create an account, and you log into every single system, website, or application that you need to interact with, right? That's why we have these huge lists of usernames and passwords. And we actually have a company here that I've known for a while who's trying to say, hey, let's get, there's a good technological solution to just avoiding that piece of it, all right? And I think they will plug nicely into the solutions that we're going to talk about here. So even with this model you applied it to the internet, it took 7 years of standards development just to come up with a safe way to do that. Meaning a way to log into a website, to register and log in that's safe and encrypted, okay? The SSL and TLS standards. It's a lot of work right there. Now, there was so much pain that built up once we had to take what was local network identity and trying to expand it to the internet, that it led to the second model of identity provider, federated identity from a third party. And the way you solved the problem was you still had just an account with an identity provider, but then you could use that to log into many other organizations. How many folks here use this model in your corporate or university life today? It's pretty well established out there. Smaller businesses, now individuals, now how many folks use some form of social login, let's say, login with Google, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn? Yeah, how many folks are really happy about doing that? Yeah, I'm not seeing too many hands go up out there. That actually was becoming very popular. It hit a ceiling a couple years ago and it started tailing off because largely of the privacy and intermediation problems that the companies that were saying, oh yeah, come log into me with that service, were actually putting a service provider in between in that position. There are other problems with this. Federated identity is not portable. It's restricted to just the services that the identity provider offers. You can't, the organization behind it doesn't have any ability to extend it. And as I said, you end up with a service provider in the middle. But that's the best we could do until blockchain. Oh, and by the way, 15 years worth, 3 generations of standards to standardize how that's being done out there. So now we move to the self-sovereign identity model. And what's interesting about it, it moves back. It says no service provider in the middle. It's actually going to be a peer-to-peer model, and it's no longer an account. It's a direct connection between you and any peer. And when we say any peer, we mean any other person, organization, or thing. Self-sovereign identity is not just for people and organizations, it's also for things. Now, what makes it work is this underlying layer of connection to blockchain. And the reason you need that is because the model that makes self-sovereign identity work, and this is where I get out, people have seen this so many times, they're like, oh, he's getting out his wallet again, right? Yes, it's my #1 prop, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, can I introduce decentralized identity? It's been working well on planet Earth for at least the last century or two, okay? I carry this wallet. I didn't get it any place, and I control it completely. I choose what credentials go in there, and then the verifiers that I want to use them with, that's what we call someone who accepts a credential, the verifier. Verifiers decide which credentials they accept, and issuers decide what credentials I qualify for, okay? I'm a Washington State resident, I have a Washington State driver's license, and TSA accepts it for me to get on a plane. There's no higher level authority. It happens the US government says these are the rules for TSA in this country, but if I go to Canada, that very foreign country to the north, or New Zealand or someplace, right? It happens we have rules, and they'll probably take that. Or they might take a passport, or they might take something else, right? Different cards for payment. Everyone decides their own rules. There's no centralized body for doing that. With decentralized identity, self-sovereign identity, all we're doing is we're taking this and we're saying, let's have that same capability online, right? Let's put that digital wallet here, and that's what it's called. And it doesn't have to be a mobile device. It could be your tablet, it could be a laptop, it could be any computing device you have, your car. They're all going to be capable of doing that. That's how we get into the Internet of Things. Now, why does blockchain help solve that problem? Why suddenly can we have those? It's because the credentials that we're going to get in that wallet, if you generate your own credential, like I print my own business card, it's got a little bit of value, but you know what? It's not going to get me on a plane, right? TSA doesn't say, I just trust you because you printed a business card. I'm going to get that card from some authority that they trust. And when it gets into my wallet, how do they know they can trust it? Well, it's because it's going to use a digital signature from a key they have registered on a public blockchain. A public blockchain that the TSA can instantly access and look up, and which they trust. That they believe, in fact, that blockchain and the address of that public key on that blockchain is something they can trust, like they could trust a DNS entry if it was secure enough, okay? And then, once I have that in my wallet, I can now go to TSA, and I love asking this question. How many folks used a mobile boarding pass last time you got on a plane? Yeah. Until about 3 years ago, I was like, I don't trust those things, It's just, and now I'm like, I don't want paper. If I can't get this, I don't want to fly in that airline, right? And I actually watched it. I just flew here from Salt Lake City, where Evernym is headquartered, and I didn't see one person in the line I was in use a piece of paper to get on that plane. That's how prevalent mobile boarding passes. So your experience, before I went there though, TSA, I had to get out that piece of plastic. I showed my mobile boarding pass, but then I had to get out the piece of plastic that is my driver's license. The experience should be that I go and I go, yeah, here's my QR code for my mobile boarding pass. Click, here's my mobile driver's license, right? They scan that, they don't have to do a black light. My ability to actually fake the thing is, just gone into the toilet, and they have to do almost nothing they literally would have a picture to verify, and that picture is, passed through digitally instead of having to use a piece of paper. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about portable, verifiable digital credentials. So that's by the way, that's the presentation process, next step. So in this system, it works again just like this. Anybody in the world, any organization can be an issuer of credentials. Any of us can carry a wallet and accept those credentials from the issuers, and then we can present them to any verifier who can decide to take them, right? Rich and Diane here could say, yeah, we can start issuing credentials. You're part of the Seattle Blockchain Meetup, right? Restaurants in the area could start saying, hey, yeah, you showed us that credential, right? Just like a piece of paper. It is, again, decentralized, and it's as strong as the cryptographic infrastructure that will be set up here. So what we're doing to standardize that, first things first, we are standardizing the decentralized identifiers, which are the address of the public key, and by the way, what we call the agent for you on blockchain. Sovrin is a blockchain being built just to do that, and nothing else. That's its whole purpose, serve as a global public utility. VerisOne is another example. Another blockchain, it's got a permissionless model, but it's being done to do that. But the DID standard, which as I mentioned, the W3C just basically said, okay, let's go ahead with the process of forming a full working group. We didn't expect it to actually generate that level of interest. We just thought the specification would go into an existing working group there. But they've decided to create a full working group and a 2-year standardization cycle to standardize on DIDs, decentralized identifiers. So I'm not going to go into that really any further. The second key standard we need is interoperable wallets. These wallets, you know, how would I feel about carrying out a proprietary piece of leather that, you know, the manufacturer of that wallet controlled what credentials I could put in or out of there, and I couldn't move them someplace else, right? And they would never do that. That's why we need portable wallets. Now, this is also a standard that Evernym has had a contract with the Department of Homeland Security to do the original spec. That spec of the architecture is at Hyperledger Indy. Happy to share that. You can just literally look up Hyperledger Indy DKMS, and you'll get the address of that document. The third one is called DID auth. It's how you use a decentralized identifier or private key to authenticate to any other person or organization or site. This is how we're going to in the next 5 years, believe it or not, the username and password is going to start to look like the fax machine. I'm serious. You know, there's been a lot of work, FIDO and other things to get there, but it's actually going to be DIDs that are going to get us over the hump, right? And we will not have to worry about that. And then lastly, the most advanced of all of them is verifiable credentials. The formal working group is called Verifiable Claims Working Group at W3C. They are 6 months from being done. Okay, we're finalizing the format and the signatures of digital credentials so they're interoperable between wallets, between sites, any place out there. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. That's as much real technology as I'm going to get into here. Any questions about the basic SSI model before I go into governance frameworks? Go ahead. Oh yeah. Now they have the running mic here.
One of your earlier slides had multiple blockchains.
Yes.
Will this be compatible with all of those blockchains, or will there be another set of standards for each blockchain?
That is a really good question. I'm going to give you the short form answer, which is the DID specification is not blockchain specific. In fact, it's designed to say, here's the generic way you do it, and then you write what's called a DID method for each type of blockchain. So there's a Sovrin DID method, Verus1 DID method, Ethereum, Bitcoin, etc. Those will get you interoperability at this level of DIDs, okay? Now, when you get up to this level and the need to be able to have interoperable credentials that you can verify and revoke the same way, you need a credential to be revocable. That involves features of a blockchain that not all of them support. So you have one level of interoperability here, but as you go up the stack, they may not be interoperable. We are working on it. The Internet Identity Workshop Conference last week was just filled with meetings between the major blockchain identity or self-sovereign identity projects to try and standardize that top to bottom. I do believe we'll get there, and we'll end up with something that's very much like the web, but for identity instead of documents. Someone, I think was another question. Go ahead. Yep. As the mic comes over.
I don't think we need the mic. Where's DID auth being developed? Who's developing that?
Oh, another great question. We're not sure exactly, because there's a number of ways of tackling it. There are a bunch of authentication protocols, as I talked about earlier on, OpenID, now FIDO, OAuth. This actually fits fairly nicely. It's what's called web authentication, WebAuth, which is just reached basically the first public review stage at the W3C. And it's got major company backing. It's basically going to be, if you're familiar with FIDO, which is how you use your phone to do cryptographic based authentication. No username and password. You're just registering with the site, and then you're just using a biometric and it's sending a signed message to log you in. WebAuthn is doing that in your browser and moving that into your browser. We thought there would be a bunch of resistance to adding this to that, or that it was going to take 2 or 3 years to work through that politics. The W3C, the DIDs have so much momentum at W3C that I just learned this morning. I wasn't there at TPAC. I was at IW. that group, the web authentication group, met and said, we will integrate that into the web authentication standard as their next work project. So things are going to go faster than we expected. Don't ask me when that means it will actually appear in your browser. I think it's at least still a year away, but it's not that far. Go ahead.
You cited a very optimistic timeline of 5 years. Given everything that's happened before in the first 2 iterations, what are the reasons for your optimism?
In terms of the 5 years, are you saying, oh, how long it'll be until we have convergence of all of these across multiple blockchains?
I guess that's a clarification. Is that a standard body timeline, or do you think there's a market?
No, I was talking about an adoption timeline, and okay, I will give you the reason for the justification, and then I'll invite you to see the rest of the presentation and see whether you agree. Self-sovereign identity is developing amazing momentum. I think even those of us that are very close to it are surprised at how fast this model is being adopted. I was just telling someone here the story. IBM, you think of IBM and Hyperledger, you think Fabric, right? That was the project they contributed at the outset. They have the most maintainers on it. They're very associated with it. At the last Hyperledger member meeting in Montreal, those of us who were there noted that there was as much discussion, general discussion about Hyperledger Indy and identity as there was about Fabric. It had reached that level of interest. And believe me, IBM's been paying attention. They have become a sovereign steward. I'll explain what that is in a little bit. They have a whole team on Sovereign now. They're integrating Sovereign with Fabric. And that's one example, okay? The self-sovereign identity model solves so many problems, not just identity problems, but authentication authorization problems, cross-domain trust problems, that it's one of the key pieces we need to get to what's been called the Internet of Value, right? Folks think about cryptocurrency as being the secret of the Internet of Value. Well, I'm here to tell you, yeah, that's cool, but wait and see what we can do with identity plus cryptocurrencies and tokens, right? So I think what's going to happen is there's so much value to be unlocked, it's going to pick up speed the same way the web did. Right? The web was sort of there, it was at the edge, and then all of a sudden it was all you heard about for the next couple of years, right? And I think that's what's going to be going on here. Now, I'm not saying all the problems are going to be solved in the next 5 years, but I think you're going to see a lot of momentum. Go ahead.
I'm curious as to
Well, hang on just a second. Record this.
Thank you. I'm curious as to what businesses beyond IBM are looking at this and starting to apply it in their work, in their enterprise.
Love that. I'm going to talk specifically at the end of this as I get through it. By the way, I prefer to have interactive, ongoing questions. So if this takes a little bit longer, Rich, we'll still have had lots of dialogue throughout. Good. I can say financial services, very tip of the spear. They tend to this makes a big difference in their area, and the credit union industry specifically is heavily involved. Government is extremely interested because they're all in the identity business one way or the other. They all want to increase trust, and they're all looking at blockchain at some level. Healthcare is definitely at the table. It's very hard to break into, but they too are seeing, hey, we've been looking for these solutions for a long time. Travel, very, very strong interest for obvious reasons when you look at the cross-border, the friction involved with travel and the benefit to the travel industry of eliminating that friction, right? Those are 4 examples. I could go into more, but those are the ones I can say. Those are folks at the table actively developing solutions.
So
Scott?
I did want to make a comment based on. I think
Okay, go ahead.
The big issue is, as Drummond had mentioned, that method 1 and 2 they don't work, they don't scale, and there's pent-up demand to get secured applications to be produced in the next layer of the internet that is waiting for self-sovereign identity to come through. So there is a push by industry to get this thing solved just so that they can get everything else on the next layer. Okay, so that's where I think things are happening. There's pent-up demand on that.
And Scott says that being an expert when I point down here, I'm talking about to the basics of public key certificates, key verification, and what's called PKI, public key infrastructure, that we have to have today. Every time you see the lock in your browser, it's because the website has a certificate for its public key. That infrastructure, which took, last 15 years to develop, and Scott's one of the Web Trust auditors that can go out and audit the certificate authorities that issue those. It's heavyweight, it's centralized, and it's not nearly flexible enough to handle the Internet of Value. So Scott is here and part of the Sovrin Governance Working Group because what we're calling the Sovereign Web of Trust is the whole next generation of that. And he's not alone. 3 of the largest CAs in the world, certificate authorities in the world, are sovereign stewards and active in the development of this. So this is the whole next generation of trust on the internet. I think it would be safe. Okay, go ahead.
In terms of implementation, would you say a shipment of mangoes could have a self-sovereign identity, or is that reserved for higher class entities like jumped up monkeys?
Absolutely. I love that. No, absolutely it will. In fact, that's one of the reasons IBM's at the table now. These standards for DIDs and this whole stack applies as much to the Internet of Things, including anything you would ship or track or produce and take through a life cycle, as much to those as they do to people and organizations that interact and control those. We can't design the whole Internet of Value without all those components. DIDs are highly scalable because even more scalable, I know, than DNS. And you're going to go, wait a minute, DNS is serving billions of lookups every day. DNS is still a centralized system. With DIDs, any blockchain can serve up a DID, and every server on that chain can give you an authenticated, a verified response to a request. So Sovrin's being scaled specifically to do that, but so is Verus One. You could use Bitcoin, Ethereum. We can have hundreds or thousands of blockchains serving up DIDs. Same standard every place. That's one of the reasons W3C has gone, whoa, this is really finally a step beyond DNS. Go ahead.
Yeah, so do you see a use case for this with members of a secret society being able to collude and identify each other on an ad hoc basis?
Yes.
And create a whole parallel civilization? Do you see
Absolutely. No, I'm not being facetious. Identity, privacy respecting identity is what this is built for. And I'm the first one to put up my hand when the questions come and go, do terrorists use the internet today? We are going to build as much protection as we can into it, but these are tools that are going to be able to be used by anyone that uses the internet. And in some cases, they will be able to use to cloak things that are going on. I believe the governance frameworks and the trust frameworks we're talking about building are going to help with that, but there's no perfect answer. Maybe one more question, then we'll keep going.
Is there discussion about cross-chain connections where you put this identity on Sovrin, and then if the Bitcoin community wanted to automatically kind of read in a copy of that and Ethereum read in a copy, when you create your ID, it goes on 20 blockchains all at the same time?
Yes, definitely. As I said, DIDs are designed to work with any modern blockchain. Interestingly, Bitcoin, because of its pretty constrained architecture, is taking the most work to develop a DID method for. But it works, and there's a community that's specifically been developing that. They have a spec called a Bitcoin DID method spec. And that, up here, we call these agents in Sovrin that would communicate over a connection. You could have an agent using a Sovrin DID talking to an agent using a Bitcoin DID or a Ethereum DID, you name it, right? It's not quite as interoperable as 2 DNS domains, right? I use .com, you use .org, but close. And over time, I think we'll get even closer. So what we're really about is decentralized, encrypted, private peer-to-peer communications between any entities out there, right? All right, one more question. Sorry, we'll limit this and then we'll try, because hopefully we'll have a bunch of questions about the next section.
So I appreciate the question back there about secret societies, because one of the concerns is, and I'd say that at the same time as you see nefarious use around that, let's say terrorism, but at the same time, those are ways in which we can get around in countries that don't have high human rights, such as China with its Great Firewall, and the ability for perhaps people who are working behind the scenes to identify that, hey, is this an agent of the government, or this is really my friend, we're working on human rights together.
That's right.
So, but that leads to an additional thing is, how much pushback are you getting from government about, well, we don't want this set up because we want to be able to examine this and be able to interfere with anybody trying to set up something that we don't control?
Yes. Interestingly enough, 2 years ago, 18 months ago, when this was newer, we were hearing more of that, and we even thought it was a little interesting that the Department of Homeland Security here in the US was sponsoring, they literally sponsored the development of the work that led to this standard and this one. And as I said, Evernym, I led the projects to do these, but we enlisted everyone, pretty much everyone in the decentralized identity community that wanted to be part of it. And DHS was actively supporting that work, tweeting about it, posting about it, featuring us at conferences. And we were a little bit like, are they sure they know what they're doing, right? Now, that was a privacy and data, identity and data privacy group there who believes that just like TLS makes for a stronger internet, right? Even if you've got a TLS, for a site that you wouldn't, you wouldn't support, but they too can have an SSL certificate. That overall cybersecurity will be increased. Our national security will be increased with this infrastructure. And yes, absolutely, will it enable human rights and will it support things like refugee for identities? I mean, for identity for refugees, potentially in countries where the government is actively opposing that or blocking that, right? Self-sovereign identity will enable that. So there's a lot of actually work going on. In fact, I'll highlight Mr. Bill Donnelly here, who's on the board of a company called iRespond that is providing self-sovereign identity in Myanmar and Thailand today for migrant workers in the fishing industry who the whole point is stopping human slavery. And he can tell you more about that in the break. All right, I'm going to pause here, and now we'll go back. And again, I invite more rounds of questions as we'll dive forward. I'm going to briefly, before I get into governance frameworks, I want to make sure that the story of what you're going to do with verifiable credentials is clear, because again, this is what's you're going to lead to why governance frameworks and how are they going to be so useful. So as I've explained, they are the cryptographically verifiable equivalents of this, of the credentials in this wallet. However, because they're digital documents, they're also going to be, just like many things digital, much more, more powerful and much more varied than the credentials we have here, okay? And they are being standardized by the W3C working group. Now, there are these three roles. The issuer of the credential gets a DID and uses that to sign the credential, issues it into your wallet, your digital wallet here, and then when you go to a verifier like TSA, you present the credential and you have set up a relationship and you sign it as well, and with your own DID. Now that's the basic infrastructure. Those three roles works for all verifiable credentials every place. And by the way, anyone who wants to copy this presentation, I share it and you can get it publicly. You can use all these slides wherever you would like. Now I want to point out two things to set up. This is the overall generic, all digital verifiable credentials work this way. Inside Sovrin, and specifically supported in Hyperledger Indy, which is the Hyperledger project devoted to self-sovereign identity. The code was initially contributed by the Sovrin Foundation to Hyperledger. There are two additional features for privacy purposes. The first one is that by default, whenever you, the holder, form a relationship with an issuer or with a verifier and set up that connection peer-to-peer, you don't use a DID on the public blockchain. You exchange what we call pairwise pseudonymous DIDs. They're not publicly discoverable. Basically what you're doing is you're exchanging key pairs, but because you're doing it with DIDs, each of you can rotate your keys and never have to affect the relationship. And that connection that you're creating, I want to point out, there's never been anything like that in the history of the internet. A connection between two of you as individuals, or you in an organization, or you in a device that has no service provider in the middle. It's yours for life, or for as long as the two parties want to maintain that connection. Either one of them can break it, but no one else can. In fact, no one else even knows about it. And that key pair that you're using is unique to that. That's why there's an important point. An issuer like the Washington State Driver's License Authority has to get a public DID, so the credentials that it issues can be checked by any verifier, right? Any verifier on the internet, any place, could verify, yep, that was signed by the Washington State Driver's License Authority. It's issued into my wallet, but when I present it to TSA, I once have created a connection with them, I'll sign it with that unique private DID, and they know it came from me, and no one else can produce that signature. So that's point number one. This is a major piece of our privacy by design architecture. The second one is even deeper, which is there are going to be 3 basic credential formats standardized at W3C in that work. And the one that Sovrin is standardizing, that we have submitted, uses zero-knowledge cryptography encoding of the credential, so that what you produce here to the verifier is called a proof of the credential, a zero-knowledge proof of the credential. And without going into details, what it means is, rather than just sharing this whole driver's license, I can share exactly the information they need. I can prove, for instance, I'm a Washington State resident. I have a legitimate driver's license. They don't see anything else. I go at a bar and prove I'm over the legal drinking age in your bar, and that's it. You don't get to see any other information. I'm not going to go deep into zero-knowledge proof cryptography. I'm just going to say this is the first infrastructure on a global basis that I'm aware of that's actually implementing as the standard, as the default. This feature of Sovrin has attracted more interest from more governments, from large corporations. This is what really got IBM's attention. And key announcement, again, just happened earlier this week. The crypto library that goes behind this wallet and what we call the agent, it's called the Indy Agent Project. At the Hyperledger Indy has got a node project for the blockchain and an agent project for this, for the credential exchange and the key management. The agent project, the crypto library, turned out to be the most advanced crypto library there. Despite having IBM and Intel and Iroha, these other projects there, none of them had tackled these projects. Now, it is based on work that IBM has been doing for the last 20 years. But that crypto project and the fact they have a fantastic security maven named Dave Hughesby meant that they finally said, hey, let's get together and create a shared crypto library for all Hyperledger projects. Let's take the standards that Indy was developing and let's get all of the key cryptographers together and create a shared project. It's been in the labs the last couple of months, and this last week it was approved by the Technical Steering Committee to become Hyperledger URSA. U-R-S-A, yes. So I think it's gonna be officially announced here soon. Don't say anything, if I jumped the gun there a little bit. So now that crypto is gonna be available to any Hyperledger project. Okay, I think I really am done with the tech. And I'll stop there again just for a second and go, any questions about that before we go into governance frameworks?
I wanted to ask these questions the last segment, but a great work on the DKMS design. I read that, it's awesome, but I couldn't find its implementations in Hyperledger Indy. Is that just a proof of concept and there's no implementation yet?
No, well, the answer there is that the DKMS functionality that is there right now is in, it's called libindy. It's the main Hyperledger library. The key management inside of that is implementing the DKMS design as fast as they can do it. There's some features that are there already, and it's going to be coming, and now it's going to again, libindy is now going to turn into URSA. And URSA plus the other agent, the Hyperledger agent, Indy agent project, is going to be implementing DKMS features. Our goal is to have what we call baseline level of that functionality done by the end of Q1.
So the crypto library name is Indy Agent?
The agent library is Indy Agent, Indy-Agent, okay? And there's a Rocket Chat channel there at Hyperledger for Indy Agent, and the other one's Indy-Node. And Indy-agent, yeah, just go in and ask them about the what's currently Hyperledger libindy. And that's crypto library that has a key management in it. And just ask about DKMS, and folks will chime in there.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, now let's talk about governance frameworks. Again, I'm done with tech now. Now we're going to talk about how we tie tech to the real world. And it's all about BLT, business, legal, and technology rules that govern not just the blockchain project. And you hear a lot of articles out there about blockchain governance. Yes, but if you actually want a solution for the real world, your governance is almost certainly going to extend to things that are off-chain, like those agents, like the credentials. And that's what I'm about to explain. Now, a quick visual metaphor to remember the BLT sandwich. I didn't come up with this, by the way. It was Daza Greenwood at MIT that came up with that acronym. But that's what all governance frameworks come down to, is just what are your business, legal, and technical policies for governing the whole thing. Best example of a governance framework, Visa, MasterCard. What makes this credit card in here work? Yeah, there's a network behind it, and there's a pile of rules about that thick. It's the rules and the belief in those rules and the trust assurance, pointing to Scott, that a particular bank or merchant is adhering to those rules is what gives everyone their confidence in the system. This thing will be true as we move to digital credentials. In fact, a simple way to put it is every digital credential that's not single use, meaning just issued by an issuer to accept back there, is going to have a governance framework behind it. That's what allows all the other verifiers to go, oh, yeah, I know that's a driver's license. It was issued by Washington State. We already have a set of states, say 3 right now, and about 4 or 5 more on the horizon. They're saying, hey, we probably need a governance framework for driver's licenses in the US. And maybe there are only 4 or 5 states initially that start issuing those driver's licenses. But now there's a framework that would cover every other state as they come online. And guess what? They're going to be using Hyperledger Indy, and they're going to be using that code base. And you're sitting there thinking, oh, how far-fetched is that? Well, I'm going to preview the Sovrin network. The first production issuers of credentials is the government of British Columbia. Canada beat us to it. Those damn Canadians. Now, what's funny is they pioneered it, but they partnered with Ottawa. Ottawa actually beat them to it by about 2 weeks. Ottawa, with a handful of entries on the Sovrin ledger for those public DIDs and credential definitions, and this, by the way, is also, I hope this tape isn't going to go out very widely very soon, because this hasn't been announced by the Canadian government yet. So you might have to elide this, but I'm going to tell this group. Ottawa has issued 4.5 million business credentials. They took a database of all the public business credentials for businesses in Ottawa, and they've converted them into Indy credentials. And they're having a centralized directory service for it called the org book. BC Gov has done 1.4 million credentials. It hasn't been announced publicly yet. All the systems, but it's not just through testing and everything else. It's done. It's in production. And now they're saying, okay, everything works. We're going to announce it sometime between now and the end of the year. But again, don't say anything to anyone about that. Okay. So this is the reason SSI, we're going to see an explosion of trust frameworks. I want to get more specific about that. When you have all this infrastructure that exists and the technology is there, the open standards are there, and then, as I'll explain shortly, you have a base trust framework for this, then all of a sudden, if you need a credential or a family of credentials to establish trust for your community online. It might be an industry community, it might be a government, it might be a smart city, right? It might be a supply chain. All you need now for a governance framework is something that says what issuers issue what credentials to what holders and what verifiers under what policies. I'm not saying it's trivial, but that is a much more tractable. Most of the projects we're looking right now, we're looking at 6 of these projects that Evernym is consulting in and the Sovrin Foundation is helping in. They're looking like 6 months. And it's not the technology at this point. It's just the definition of the policies, ratification of the policies by the communities involved. So I'm going to talk to you quickly about the specifically governance framework that Sovrin's developed. Sovrin, by the way, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I think I skipped over the slide earlier on where I explained that Hyperledger Indy, open source, anyone can go create identity solutions based on that, self-sovereign identity solutions. The Sovrin Foundation is a nonprofit governance organization set up to govern a network, a global network for self-sovereign identity using Hyperledger Indy code. They actually contributed that code to Hyperledger to get, to have it, a community grow around it. Evernym is simply a commercial vendor. We were the original, creators of that code base, helped create the Sovrin Foundation because we recognized it had to be a global public utility, and now are very active contributors to Hyperledger Indy. We're just a commercial company that's building solutions on top of Sovrin. So Sovrin is not just a blockchain. It's always been from the outset designed to be the home of a governance framework. That's what the nonprofit is for. That's the working group that I chair. It was originally called a trust framework, and I'll explain in a minute why we changed the name. This is actually a chart from World Economic Forum, a paper back in January, that laid out the whole sort of how decentralized or self-sovereign identity is evolving and the different solutions out there. And yes, Sovrin is the most high and to the right, but you'll notice Uport, which is Ethereum-based, Learning Machine, which is actually wants to be neutral, support multiple DID methods, are there. That's, again, that's a public white paper you can go look up. And what's unique about Sovrin is it's been governed from the outset. We call it hybrid because it's a public blockchain that's going to be accessible by anyone once the full governance framework is in place. But the nodes are actually run by trusted institutions. And the governance framework is what defines what that means. There's 7 categories of institutions that can qualify, plus actually the 8th is any other, even a commercial vendor, right, could come along and say, we'll make the promises necessary that we're going to adhere by this framework, and we're going to support this mission. And by the way, all of them, as stewards running a node, they're not paid a cent. There is no inherent reward in being a steward other than the reputational benefit, and you're able to learn and get steeped in the technology. And there are now more than 50 approved stewards. I think it's going to be close to 60 by December. This is just a smattering of examples. So the governance working group there, which was the second one after the technical governance board to be formed, has over 30 people working on it. We've been working for the last year on the second generation. The first generation, called Sovereign Trust Framework, was about a 9-month effort and was approved in July, and the network went live in July of last year, July 31st. We had the Genesis ceremony, 10 of the initial stewards, and all the Genesis transactions were done. It's been running in sort of call it a beta-style mode since then, and we've been waiting to upgrade the code, and the 1.6 version that we've been waiting for quite a while just started getting installed earlier this week. The test network, it's been out there for about a month. So that's really going to bring it up to what many people consider production level. And at the same time, what we've just done is reached the public review period for the second generation trust framework. That working group for the last year has been developing it, and that's the address. You can also Google Sovrin Governance Framework, it'll take you right there. And you can see all their links to 8 Google Docs that represent this. And I'm not going to go deep into this, but if you're wondering, well, what's the structure of one of these governance frameworks? We've actually developed this, and the legal team and the policy team worked on this to say, this is a structure of the Sovereign Governance Trust Framework, and you can use it for any other governance framework you need. It's really a template. And the basic idea of the template is you have the master documents, or the root of everything else, and that says, okay, this is the structure of the whole thing. You separate out the glossary because it's so critical. This glossary now has over 200 terms in it. So if you really want to dive deep into understanding self-sovereign identity, and it's very readable, it's just there are a lot of terms. There's one legal agreement in the whole thing because a sovereign network only needs an agreement between the Sovereign Foundation and each steward, okay, all around the world. Other governance frameworks, you might have different agreements with the different parties that are involved. That's part of what you design. And then we developed this feature we call the control documents, which is rather than stuffing everything into one big document, This is more like the Constitution, and this is legislation. Where you take groups of policies that should be governed by different stakeholders and group them together and then let them manage those. These now can be versioned independently, and there are 4 of them that we've designed. And that whole list is at that URL that I had on the last slide. Now, in addition to this, these are what we call the normative documents, the ones that agreement references these as appendices, and these are just inherited by all those. We have over here, which we call the Trust Assurance Framework. Big nod to Scott there. He is the primary author, or the lead author of that. If you think if this is going to set up the policy, the BLT rules, this is how you can assess any actor in the covered by the trust framework as to their compliance. And that means, in our case, it's stewards, right? Is your node, is it properly secured? Are you following the privacy practices, right? Are you doing background checks on personnel, things like that. We have a question already, and that's fine, which is another good stopping point to ask any questions. We have the mic race.
Sorry, I don't know if this is now a great time to ask a question, but I'm just trying to get my head around. So for example, for control documents, I did see in the previous slide that there was quite a few banks there. So for example, under the control documents, might one of those things be, particularly for like banking investment, we have a lot of KYC, AML, so know your customer, anti-money laundering stuff that has to be done in the investment and banking world.
Yes.
Would that be one of the control documents that's sort of a subset of
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good example. Ironically, you bring up that example, and I'm going to show you in a minute. That subject is so big, we expect there to be an entire, we call domain-specific trust framework about that. And if you look at it that way, then you could say, oh, well, what would be a control document there? It might be, okay, there's a set of procedures that are, called onboarding procedures that are standardized. You'd have one control document for that. You'd have another control document for maybe something like shared signaling, right? You see, you got problems. You want to. What's the standard way that you turn around, and if you run into an issue, it's reported, right? Then regulatory compliance, whatever it is, however you want to parse out your policies, your BLT policies, so that there's a group. Now, another example. Actually, I'm not going to go into that example. I'm going to get into it in a minute. Go ahead.
So one thing to look at is this is to govern sovereign. And the industry layer that you're talking about, the banking industry, will be a layer on top of this that will need to have its own governance structure.
Yeah.
So this is fairly simple because it only governs what sovereign does, which is the steward network and the interoperability and cooperation amongst themselves and with the sovereign governance board. So it's fairly simple. But as you get to more regulated industries, that governance structure gets a lot more complicated.
Exactly. In fact, hold any other questions for a minute because I'm about to cover that, and then it'll really set up, I think, questions about applicability to your specific spaces. Domain-specific governance frameworks. Okay. Here is what is always been a particular. Sovereign Trust Framework initially, and now Sovereign Governance Framework has always been designed to be this foundation that Scott was just talking about for other governance frameworks. And we've used this for a long time. I had 2 boys and mountains of Legos at my house. And so that baseboard you get for super large Lego sets is a good example of that's what the Sovereign Governance Framework, very thin, but very broad. And what you do is you plug in higher level, what we call domain-specific governance frameworks. Now, I just used the example of in the financial services industry, whether it's banks or credit unions, KYC is a regulatory requirement pretty much around the world. The regulation is not the same every place, but the requirements are similar. And there's all this talk about portable KYC. Why would you have to go and redo the whole KYC process with every bank and credit union? Well, regulations currently require that, but the emergence of SSI and digital credentials is going to make it possible to finally have portable KYC. And we believe, we're already talking to regulatory authorities that are like, hey, that could be a good thing. And we could enable that in legislation to save everyone money and time and actually do a better job at KYC. That would be a very broad but still domain-specific governance framework. Now, it might be that initially there's a KYC domain framework just for the US or North America or a particular industry. But we do believe that's one area where it's a good example. You could have one that's broad. Classic examples, right? Country-based governance frameworks. Finland's already looking at one. Estonia. Smart cities. Toronto is a really good example where they're trying to develop a whole smart city and saying, we need a domain-specific governance framework for that. So hold questions right now. I'm going to finish this out, and then we can dive down into it. A simple way to look at it is Sovereign Governance Framework designed to be this baseboard. I'm going to talk about this one, COID, and briefly about this one for medical licensing. Pharma is interested in that, right? Medical drug testing and the sharing of medical records and clinical trial information. Lots of privacy information about that. International travel, we're already working with CETA and some other folks in that area. There will be hundreds, thousands of domain-specific governance frameworks. All of them can use the same underlying technology, same underlying framework. Now, I'm going to quickly just, any of you out there thinking about your business, think about it this way. If you need trust in your community, think about the digital credentials. Just think about the physical credentials. If you could do them online, think about them. How many issuers and verifiers would be involved? Okay, what credentials would be involved? If you have something that a community needs, you need a governance framework. But don't look at it as, hey, this is a big job in front of us. Look at it, if we can just answer those questions, suddenly we have this rocket fuel for a new way to reduce friction and increase business online. Okay, this is a business opportunity for these different. Now folks are coming, it's not just sovereign stewards, but others are recognizing light bulbs going on, and they're coming and saying, how can we do this? One of our next things, the governance working group, Sovereign Foundation, is produce a template for these domains. We have enough folks coming, they're like, okay, give us a template. So we're going to be doing that. And the thing to understand is digital credentials, just like websites had a network effect, right? Everyone that came to your site and then formed links to your site brought more people to your site. The same thing is going to be true of digital credentials, right? It's the same network effect that telephones had, only apply it to credentials. Every credential that you issue as an issuer is a new connection, potentially for life, with that customer or that supplier, okay? And it has the same network effect as any other network. So yeah, I was just saying the same thing. So I'm gonna finish by really taking this all the way down to the bare metal with an example of what CU Ledger is doing with MyCUID. CU Ledger is global consortia created for one purpose: blockchain solutions for the credit union industry. Started in the U.S., Canada came on board, and then about 6 months ago, World Council of Credit Unions, they're all in. Unanimous across all of their, and they by the way, are owned, it's technically a CUSO, credit union service organization, owned by credit unions and other CUSOs. So it's an industry inside organization. And their first initiative is a standard digital credential of credit union membership. If they can standardize that, any credit union in the world can issue one. You can do all kinds of new financial services across. You can essentially have the credit unions of the world acting larger than the biggest bank, right? And there are many things that could unlock for that industry. It's transformative. It's digital transformation, not at the level of an individual branch, but a whole industry. It's Julie Esser, who's the Chief Engagement Officer for CU Ledger, and I will be talking at the Hyperledger Global Forum and giving a talk on self-sovereign identity and transforming consumer identity. So their goal, by the way, the first 1 million operating digital credentials in your self-sovereign wallet on your Android or iOS phone by the middle of next year. And there are 235 million, or 234 million to go, so that's just the tip of the iceberg. And the way we like to put it is, the race is on. It's not just about what's in your wallet, but from your standpoint as a business owner, what's in your customer's wallet. It's going to give a whole new meaning to that term. So that's it. That's all I've got. Now we can go to all Q&A here. Yeah, we probably, can move back to different slides. Okay, we'll start back there.
So when can we use Fabric CA with DIDs?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the whole question. Can you ask that again?
Okay, so when can we use DIDs on Fabric?
Oh, okay, so DIDs come in specific flavors called a DID method designed for a specific chain. So they're sovereign DIDs for sovereign, and as I just explained, the first ones are now in production, issuing government credentials in 2 provinces of Canada. Verus1, another one, self-sovereign identity blockchains, has been issuing, or you can go and register a personal DID today on Verus1 for you as an individual. And there are libraries they have to essentially use that. There's called the Credential Handler API, and you basically have your wallet in the cloud. And they offer that service today. You can go, you can use it. I think there's just a couple sites that are starting to use it. Okay, that's one configuration of how this can be done. Uport for Ethereum is issuing credentials today that you can go and get DIDs that are Ethereum based. And there are a couple other examples out there that I think you can IPFS has a form of DID. So all of those chains are actually issuing. Now, you say issuing, another thing to point out about DIDs is the method defines how the DID is actually created. In Bitcoin or Ethereum, your DID is based on your address on the ledger. Okay? So you don't actually have a DID until you've done a transaction with the ledger and you get that address. Okay? Sovereign turns that around. Your DID is based on an ED25519 key pair, elliptic curve key pair. It's the first 128 bits of your public key, your verification key, base 56 encoded. You have a DID you generated in your wallet. That's why when we do pairwise DID exchange, it doesn't involve a public ledger at all. It's direct, agent to agent. You don't need a ledger. So different DID methods define the format and then the operations for how the DID is created, looked up, updated, and revoked. Hopefully that answers your question. Happy to go deeper into DIDs. I am the co-editor of that spec and put a lot of time frame into that one. More questions?
Thank you. Looking at the credit union program where they're going to have DIDs for all their members, is that correct?
Yes.
How, if I had that DID, how would I then authenticate myself to the credit union on their website or at the bank?
Perfect question. So that program I was talking about, it's called the Million Member Milestone Program. And the question you just asked is the only question they're going after initially, the very first use case. They call it call in, walk in, log in. And it's to take your self-sovereign identity wallet and your MyCUID credential and be able to use it to authenticate yourself. If you call into a call center, that's actually the first one because it's the highest potential for fraud. So it's the first one they want to tackle. And then how you do it walking in. So literally, like I said, the barcode instead of showing it like a driver's license. And then the third one is login on the website. And the reason they put that one third is because that does involve integration with the website. So they literally, in stack ranking their use cases, said call-in center, most fraud, actually easiest because one integration with the back-end system and all the call center can use it with any customer that has a mobile phone, iOS or Android. And it's, I can actually get you a presentation of how it works, but it's remarkably simple. They're already writing scripts. Credit union customer calls in the first time, and they have to go through the 20 questions, right? They're going to add a question right at the outset. Do you have a smartphone? And if the answer is yes, and they have the phone number on file, or you give it to them, at the start of the call, they're going to text you a link. And during the call, you will download the app. The app will automatically be pre-configured with a microsite to form the connection with the credit union, and then when they're done with the set of calls, and they will actually ask you more questions that first time to authenticate you, they'll issue the credential. The next time you call in, their records will be marked. You will already have a MyCUID. As soon as your call comes in, your phone will buzz. You add a biometric. You're authenticated. And then the same thing, like I said, the mobile version, and then the web version, you will actually scan a QR code on the website. And that is what generates the authentication response.
And has the Sovrin Foundation created that chain of events, that framework? Sorry.
No, it's a great question. That's actually the standards for doing that are going to be that's DID off, and it's basically our initial specification for doing that. The policies for issuing the credential and accepting it are going to be part of the MyCUID governance framework, and we meaning Evernym, Sovrin Foundation, and a few other industry organizations are working with CULedger on that today. Anyone who's interested in being part of that, by the way, you can do it. It's an open, there you go. We'll plug you right in. Other questions?
How are we going to protect customers from handing over all of their information and accelerating the move to a post-privacy world?
One question. By post-privacy world, do you mean make it worse, as in sharing even more information?
Yeah. How do we protect customers from clicking on OK on every EULA they see?
Right.
Which we do.
We could have a whole session just on that. I work with, actually, the only other person in my group at Evernym, her name is Elizabeth Reneris, is one of my favorite privacy attorneys in the world, and the only US member of the EU Blockchain Observatory, advising the EU Commission on blockchains and GDPR, because there's an inherent tension there, right? Blockchains are open, public, immutable ledgers, and GDPR says, hey, you need the right to be able to, forget data. And we're literally tackling this question. Well, if you as an individual have the right to go have a DID on the sovereign public ledger, a public DID if you want one, it's immutable. That's part of the security property. So what are they saying? No individuals, you should not be able to have self-sovereign identity in a public. It's put us in a bind. We are actively developing that dialogue, and the Sovrin Foundation and the stewards are trying to come to a public position and talk to you and go, we think we've got a great tool to help you with GDPR, but help us by clarifying it can be used by individuals. That's only half the question. The question you're asking is, if I've got this wallet here, I'll pull up this version, right? And it's got all these credentials, all this sensitive information I can share now with just one click of a button. What's to prevent that from going out, right? What's to prevent sites from now just saying, just give me everything in your wallet or give me all this information?
Your location data for the last
yes.
20 years of your life.
It's a great question. I'm not going to sit here and say there's a panacea, but I had this dialogue, interesting enough, at about 1:30 last night on Slack with Elizabeth, because she was just presenting to, I'm trying to remember, it's Epic is a member of it. It's a privacy forum, a large one here in the US. And she and another person from Evernym did a whole presentation on Sovrin and that. And the hardest question they got was that. It was like, hey, you've built all these wonderful privacy respecting features, but now it's just that easy to just give away this data. And so she lobbed the question at me and said, what would you say to that, right? And my answer was two things. First, all the information that comes in and out of that wallet goes through an agent. That agent is not provided. It's not Facebook or Google or a third party that has an interest in getting all your data. Its interest is in working on your behalf. So what we will see is a competition for agents that are protecting your privacy. Okay, and I'm literally talking about AI that is literally saying, hey, that website should not be asking for that information. My agent can see what they're asking for, no one else can. But my agent can turn around and say, you don't need to give that up, or in fact, this site over here is not asking for that information, and they offer the same or better service, see what I mean? So we can start to build privacy policies into our side of the equation. And I personally think that's going to be very powerful. I could go deeper into the solutions there, but I want to make sure we have time for other questions.
Yeah, sure. So, do you feel like the ideas behind Sovrin are good enough that they could have legs beyond their current governance model? Like, for example, could somebody fork Sovrin? Would they have any barriers to doing that from a technical or legal intellectual property standpoint? And what role do you feel the ability to do that plays in the governance, I guess, of open source projects and public blockchain projects in general?
Yes. So first, unqualified, yes. In fact, an enthusiastic yes. We would love to see Hyperledger. So that code base is Hyperledger Indy. Okay? Sovrin, as a public trust organization, chooses to run it. In fact, it's part of the governance framework. As a sovereign steward, thou shalt run the approved version of the Hyperledger Indy code. So, but that Hyperledger Indy code is there for anybody to run for any purpose. There are already other folks setting up private self-sovereign identity networks. And there's even been discussion of other public self-sovereign identity networks based on the same code base, just with different governance. I couldn't be more enthusiastic. If we have a global competition for the best self-sovereign identity, we're going to have a much better internet for all of us, no matter who wins. And I say that, as a stakeholder in Sovrin. I would rather see self-sovereign identity win than any one company, even Evernym or even one. Sovrin's a nonprofit, the Sovrin Foundation, so we just want to see it happen. And by the way, there's one more point there. The more ability to fork, I'm a big believer that the ability to fork a open source project and change the governance is one of the best drivers of good governance. Because you have an alternative, right? It forces you to pay attention.
Since Sovrin is a blockchain, writing to it is going to cost something, and I believe there's a token model with Sovrin. In 5 years, are we going to see these tokens for sale on Binance, just like every other token? Or is there something specific about Sovrin that's free?
So you've asked a question that the Sovrin Foundation has been working actively on for the last 2 years. And we published a white paper in January that did describe the general purpose or general goal of a Sovrin token, which is economic sustainability of Sovrin as a network. I am part of also what's called Economic Advisory Council in terms of figuring that out. I've learned more about tokens and tokenomics than I ever expected in my life, and it's hard. It is really hard. I can't answer that question in terms of what will happen in the broader market. What I can tell you is that the 1.6 upgrade to the Hyperledger Indy code includes support for a token with a network, but it will not be active. It's not ready yet to do that. So there are many other upgrades in the code, and so that is there. You can go to Hyperledger Indy and look at that code. It's actually a plugin architecture for tokens, and the actual Sovrin token is being developed open source, also on GitHub, but under the Sovrin Foundation, so it's not, so that it's Sovrin specific, whereas Hyperledger Indy is for anyone that wants to use it. So anyone could create a token plugin and use it with that code base. The design of the Sovrin token is I just came back from a meeting just on that topic in Salt Lake. I think we're substantially down the road, but we're not there and done yet. Sometime next year it's going to come out, and what the tokenomics will be is still to be determined. So can't give you anything further there. Is that saying one more question? All right.
Thank you. So I was waiting till the end of the session to ask this question because it's kind of a very high-level question. So we are talking about the SSIs, and this is great. At the same time, currently we have these big companies that are based on using people's information, even sell it with give it to advertisers, and they are not going anywhere anytime soon.
They're not going quietly into the evening?
Yes. So how do you see some sort of a collision, or do you think that they might try to somehow delay the development of self-sovereign identities?
I'm glad you asked that question last. I'm going to give you a very personal or direct point of view on that, watching that whole thing evolve, and knowing that some of those companies, I've worked with identity teams at almost every one of those companies over the last 20 years, right? Google's one of the sponsors, Microsoft, regularly of the Internet Identity Workshop. So all of them are aware of what's happening with SSI. I believe all of them are figuring out or working right now. They probably have teams assigned. What are we going to do about this? Okay. One thing I can tell you Google's doing right now is it's coming to conferences with a team. I'm trying to remember the name of the project. I think it's called, it used to be called Data Portability Project, and they have a new name for it now. But basically, they're saying, we're building tools and APIs so you can export your data out of Google. It doesn't mean you can delete it all out of Google. That's a separate GDPR-related thing. But you can take it all and put it into other services, which means one of the places you'll be able to put it is under the control of your agent. I believe that each of them have their own strategy and analysis of how to deal with SSI. I haven't seen any signs that those companies are going to actively try and block it. In fact, the question comes up more often, are they going to try and subsume it? Are they going to turn around and go, wait a minute, all of a sudden one day, and here's your Google, self-sovereign identity, here's your agents, it's all set up for you, just turn it on like Google Plus, right? Google Agent, right? Or Apple Agent, right? Hey, Siri and all those things, they're all working on various. The actual strategic impact on them as companies, I think it's like that would be the tip of the iceberg. The thing to worry about is their iceberg going to sink their Titanic? The shifts in what will happen, I think, with personal data and how much we can control it, I think are going to be cataclysmic. And don't ask me to predict what's going to happen there, but I do think that we will see we're going to see I've heard this term recently, a clawback of privacy, right? I think it's a financial term, clawback, right? I think we're going to see a resurgence of privacy on the internet. And what I think we're going to see is companies that start to realize if they're not directly in the business of monetizing your personal data, they're going to start jumping over to this side and saying, no, we want that trusted relationship. We want that direct connection with you. And we're going to agree to your terms for respecting your data. Because they've already got GDPR pushing them in that direction one side, and suddenly it's like, that's the stick, here's the carrot. A new trusted relationship, what Timothy Ruff, the CEO of Evernym, calls the new relationship. Self-sovereign identity is going to be less about identity, more about the new trust relationship, the new set of products and services you can get through that trusted connection. And that, I think more than anything, is going to be, it's going to change the status quo of the web today. So thanks for that great question. Thanks for all of the great questions. Happy to keep talking about this in our after.
Thank you. As always, thank you, Drummond. Fantastic job. Excellent. Good job again. Fantastic.